My name is Max Eisen. I was born in Czechoslovakia, in a town called Moldava, not Bodovo. It was in the eastern part of Slovakia. I was born in 1929, March the 15th, and we are ethnic Hungarians because this is the language we spoke in our home. I learned Slovak when I started school, and I lived in a large property. You might call it a compound. 3 families lived in a large home. My paternal grandparents and my uncle and aunt, and we had a big yard. There was a lumber yard, and we had a big vegetable garden, and we had several acres of fruit trees, and our property was a closed, fenced-in property. We had a large fence with a barbed wire on top and a large gate for traffic of horses and buggies. People used to come and buy lumber from my grandfather's yard, and there was a smaller gate for pedestrian traffic, and these gates were open during the day. The property was patrolled by my dog Farkas, who was an Alsatian, and we also had 2 fox terriers. One was Eli and the other one was Prince. And in the evening, before we went to bed, the gates were locked, and Farkas was in charge of the entire property. And I cannot recall that our property was ever entered in the middle of the night, because there was a lot of things that people would come and steal, perhaps lumber or fruits from the trees. And so we depended on Farkas an awful lot. And he was a tawny, dark black colored dog. My fox terriers were all white and black spots. And my mother used to know when we were coming home from school. The way he used to bark, my mother knew whether it was a friend or a foe coming. Later on in 1942, there was an incident when we were taken away, deportation of some families from my town under the Hungarians, when my mother, my aunt, and my 2 younger brothers and myself, 2 gendarmes came and they picked us up from our home. And my grandfather and grandmother and my aunt were not involved in this deportation. My grandfather was a decorated officer from the First World War, so he had a pass. It was apparently people who were not Hungarian citizens. My mother and my aunt were born in Slovakia, although it was the old Austro-Hungarian monarchy, but they claimed that they are not Hungarians. And we were gone for several weeks. And when I came back 2 or 3 weeks later, we were fortunate that we were not taken over the border to the Ukraine, where many Jews were murdered in a place called Kamenets-Podolsk. And we came back home, and we walked from the railway station. We were about a half kilometer away, and Farkas had such a acute sense of smell. We were perhaps less than a half kilometer from our gate. I could see the property, the house. He came flying through the gate, and he stopped. He put the brakes on, and he stood up on his hind legs, and he was licking me all over the face, and he just wouldn't stop. And he had to do this to my 2 younger brothers and my mother. And I will never forget that moment. That was such a wonderful moment coming back from, we didn't know, but we came back from the jaws of destruction. And that repeated itself 2 years later. We celebrated a Seder. We sat at the dinner, and we told the story of the Exodus, and my younger brother asked the 4 questions of the Manishtana. Why is this night different than any other night? Why do we eat bitter herbs tonight? And it was truly a miracle that my father and uncle were home from the labor battalion. So my immediate family were all there. I had many other uncles and aunts that lived in different towns. Passover 1944, and the Seder was on a Friday night, so it was the Sabbath. And my little sister, she was just a baby, about 8 or 9 months old. And the only person we were missing was my Aunt Bella, who died a year before in 1943. She was an invalid. And I believe we retired about 12 o'clock. And we knew that next morning we're going to get up at a leisurely time, and we'll walk to the synagogue and we'll repeat the same Seder, the second night of the Passover Seder. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, in the middle of the night, our gates are closed, locked for the night. Somebody is knocking on the gate, and Farkas was right away in his guard mode, and he was barking. And the windows were open because it was a balmy night. And my father looked out the window, and the man is saying, he says, Zoltan, that was my father's first name, and they were on first name basis. Open the gates, I have to come in with my horse and wagon. And that was a very unusual thing, and this was a forester in our area. We knew him because my grandfather, when he was buying sections of forest, he had to work with a forester. And this forester was also a customer in my father's cellar. He came to drink there and socialize. And this was a very unusual event. Everybody was up, and my father took him into my grandfather's quarters because my grandfather was the head of the family, and whatever my grandfather said was law. And so everybody sort of trooped in, and this man said that he just came. It was probably 2 o'clock, perhaps 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't know. That he just came from the pub in town, and there are a bunch of gendarmes that were brought in from neighboring villages, and they're going to collect all the Jewish people the next morning. And he said that, I want you to get on my wagon right now, and I'm taking you away, and I'm going to hide you in the forest. So that was quite a shock to hear a story like this. And I was already thinking of 1942, 2 years before. And so my grandfather said, look, this is the Sabbath, and there's just no way we're going to go on a horse and buggy. This is not allowed for us to travel on the Sabbath. And there was no, he was begging, but my grandfather just would not be moved. And that was whatever my grandfather said was law. So he left, and I thought it was such a surreal situation. Lay down in my bed, and my head was spinning with all these thoughts of, could this be happening again? All those horrible memories from 1942, just, what can we do? We need to do something. But there was just nothing I could do. Early morning, the gate is being knocked by gendarmes, and Farkas is barking his head off. And everybody was up suddenly, and 2 gendarmes were inside the property, and we were the first unit right near the gate, our doors to our unit. And they just kicked in the doors, and they were in our bedroom, and they were yelling and screaming. This was quite a wake-up call. I mean, to be woken up by 2 gendarmes yelling and screaming in your own bedroom, while they were saying that you have 5 minutes to pack a bundle and we are taking you away. And they said, if you have any money or jewelry, hand it over, because where you're going to have no need of this. It was total pandemonium. And my mother said, put on layers of clothing. She told us. I was 15, my younger brother was 12, and the little one was, I believe, 8, and my little sister was 9 months old, so she held the baby in her arms. And my father said, put your boots on. We had custom-made winter boots. And my father, knowing from the labor battalions that he was drafted into for the last 3 years, he knew that good boots are very important when you're going into the unknown. So, and we had these wonderful good boots. It was made by a shoemaker in my town. His name was Mr. Gutman. And my father went into the quarters of my grandparents to see how they were getting ready. And at that time in 44, my grandfather was 67 years old. I thought he was an ancient person. But he was 67 years old. He was a tall, strong man. My grandmother was 65. My father was 42, and my mother was 40. And in this pandemonium, our neighbor, Eli Klinka, she came running in. She lived across the street from us. And the gendarmes were yelling at her, "Get out of here, this is not your business." But she stood her ground. And I will never forget this. She said to my mother, "Ethel, where are you taking this baby? Why don't you leave the baby with me?" And of course, if a mother is asked to give away her baby, I mean, my mother decided not to. And I wonder to this day, had she left the baby, would she have survived? Probably it would have been a possibility, but we'll never know. And we were hustled out from our home and our property, and the gates were locked, and we were collected in the schoolyard, in the school, 450 Jews from my town. And we spent the first night in the school, laying on the floors, wondering, what are we doing here? Our home is only 20, 25 minutes away. Imagine old people, babies, young, about 200 some odd in one room and 200 some odd in the next room. And there were very, facilities were out in the school. There was no running water, so there were outhouses for us kids. This is what we could use, and we were guarded by Hungarian gendarmes. And the next morning, all of us were assembled in the schoolyard, and 450 Jews were made to march through the town, in between the townsfolk, so we're on both sides of the road. We had a terrible send-off. People were throwing and spitting at us and yelling at us some awful things. Stinking Jews, you'll get what you deserve. And many were looking out the windows of our Jewish homes. People, in the window, they were looking out from the homes of the Jewish people. They moved into these homes virtually that very night while we were sealed off in the school. And we were marching by our property, the fenced-in property. The railway station was just a few minutes not far from us. So as we're marching by, I remember Rabbi Tenenbaum, with his long white beard, he was made to walk in front of the column. It's like the rabbi is leading his flock. It was an exodus of the Jews from Sepsi to the unknown, and his wife was an invalid. She had to be carried by her sons on a chair because there was no wheelchairs. And as we walked by our property, Farkas knew that we were in this group of people. And he was barking his head off. And he knew that he was more humane than, there was not a single human being in town who cared of what happened to the Jews. There were a few, like Eli Klinka, perhaps a few others. But Farkas certainly knew it was sort of a goodbye and sort of saying, be strong or whatever. And for the next year that I was incarcerated, I always remembered Farkas barking. And I could hear him right up until we were put on the train and sent to Kasha, which was about 50 kilometers away, to the brickyard. This dog had a soul. He was crying and he was warning us that there's a danger. Not so the people of my town. And these people in my town, with whom we have lived for generations, literally, with whom we did business with whom, people that we helped all the time, they had no heart. And I found out a year later when I came back, our neighbor Eli Klinka told me, when we were forcibly removed from our homes during the first day of Passover, sealed up in the school, and by the night, every single Jewish home was ransacked to the bare walls in my town. The synagogue was desecrated. The Torah scrolls were taken out from the ark, cut into ribbons and worse, and the prayer books and the Talmudic books were burnt in a fire. this is what happened in my town. And, in my town, there were some good Christian people, and there were others. There was a Roman Catholic church, and there was a Protestant church, and there was a synagogue. So this was a microcosm of what happened in one town. And you can multiply this in Hungary and all over Europe by the thousands and thousands. I knew in a few days after I was taken to Birkenau, Auschwitz, that most of my family were gassed. My father and uncle were selected out in July. So I knew that all of my family were gone. I was in Auschwitz for 9 months, 3 months in 3 other camps. Left Auschwitz January the 12th, 1945. Can you imagine you're out on a job site, you're baked by the sun, there's no water, you're working from morning till night in this burning sun, and the only liquid that you have is a cup of tea in the morning, and at lunchtime you receive your ladle of soup, which is mostly water. This was in Auschwitz. We were working outside of Auschwitz on a job clearing land, and the guards are in a cordon around us, sort of sitting in the shade, and we are in the middle, so they can see us all the time. We have a half an hour lunch, and this SS guard is sitting, and he takes out his sort of a canvas bag where he had a thermos bottle, I guess, coffee, and a sandwich, and he's eating his sandwich, and his dog is sitting beside him, a German Shepherd, and he's on the ground, flat out, and he's just watching. And he's eating this sandwich, and he takes a crust, and he throws it in front of him, the guard, about 8 feet in front of him. Hunger was so bad. And I kept thinking I was watching this man eat this sandwich and drinking coffee. I mean, can you imagine when you have a rolling hunger in your belly and you watch a person eating away, and in black bread I could see, I don't know what was inside, but there was something inside, maybe ham or speck or something. And you would do anything for a piece of crust. And I knew that I wouldn't go there. I wanted to go, but I figured, these dogs are... So somebody took a run for this piece of crust. This guard was going to have some sports, some fun, you see. Imagine being a guard day in, day out, guarding prisoners out on the job. So this guy came and he grabbed his, and all he did is said one word, and this dog flew out and grabbed this guy's hand, and you could hear the crunch of the bones. And he held him until he was told to let go, and this man was finished. I mean, his hand was a mess. And once this happened to you, you were gone. You were, you can't work, you go to the gas. This was a death sentence, you see. So he was gone, but the next day he wasn't on the job. It's called a commando. And so this is what dogs can do if they're trained. Yeah, they're trained to be killers. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I watched the kennels where they had these beautiful pups, and they had a wire running around the track. There was a ball, it was made, I don't know what was inside, but the outside was the same clothing that we used to wear, the striped clothing. And they were running after this around and around. So they were teaching them since they were pups that anything with the stripes is something that they need to catch, you see. And you know how pups are, they're falling all over themselves, head over, And they were so, they don't have the coordination yet, you see. And it just broke my heart. I mean, I love to see animals, and I kept thinking, what are they going to do later when they're trained? Yeah, it was a terrible place. But I was hoping that one day, if I'll get out of here, perhaps Farkas will be there, that I will come home again, and Farkas will be waiting for me. Somebody of my family. So that was an incentive for me, I guess, just to put one foot in front of the other. And I had this fear since we were liberated by the tank unit, and I kept thinking, now I'm liberated. But do I really have a home? Am I free? I'm liberated, but am I free? Where am I going to go? You see, I could not get over the trauma of being sent out a year before by the townspeople in such a terrible way. I said, what am I going to come home to? You see the dilemma. You don't know what to do, where to go. I'm very sick. We had to register when the Americans, after they liberated us. And I went to some hospitals, and one day it was on the loudspeaker that everybody that is going to Czechoslovakia is to come to the square the next day. There are some trucks, and so I was loaded up on a truck, so I was sort of forced. And this was the first time I went out of the gates of Ebensee. I was very uneasy to face this whole new scenario, new world out there on my own. But we were about 40 kids, and approximately, and they each went, everybody went a different way, and I sort of separated from them after I arrived in Budapest, and I was on my own to go back to my house, to my home. It was very unfortunate when I came back home. It was totally quiet in this property that was so busy a year before, and a neighbor was living in my property, and when I was walking towards the property, I could see it from a kilometer away. And a year before, that place was such a busy place. My grandparents, my uncle, aunt, and my family, the yard was full of chickens, geese, and ducks. I mean, it was a busy place, and the 3 dogs patrol. And I knew that the closer I was getting, Farkas would know that I'm coming back. And he wasn't there. It was a dead place. It was quiet. There was not a single chicken. Everything was total quiet. And I opened the door, and the neighbor was sitting in my mother's kitchen. And she didn't recognize me. I wore a Hitler Youth shirt because this is the only clothing that the Americans could find. In a warehouse they found a big storage of Hitler Youth shirts and corduroy breeches. That was what I was wearing, and I couldn't button up the shirts because my chest was full of wire. And she was not happy to see me. Because you see, these people, they thought, well, these Eisens are gone, and I've been here now for a year, this is my property now. She wouldn't give me a glass of water, and I had to leave the property. I was very concerned, you know. I figured, what happens if her husband comes or somebody? I felt threatened. I felt like I'm a stranger, I'm encroaching in somebody's property. This was the craziest thing. So I walked out of my property, and I did this walk from my own to the center of town. It was the most awful walk because people saw me and they simply ran into their homes. They didn't want to see me. Others were working away in their gardens who belonged to the Jewish people before, who didn't come back. As if it was their own property. Everything was like a normal life, but the Jews were not there. And so my friend was there, the 2 brothers, and one other person. And from my town of 450 people, less than 20 of us came back. I was hoping to come back to have a peaceful place to put my head down after this trauma of 1 year. I'm hoping to meet my dog, Farkas. And the only person that I met that really helped me was Eli Klinka. The rest of the people were very hostile. She saw me and she knew, she says, you are sick. I mean, water was up to here, I couldn't breathe. I had wet pleurisy. You know, coming out of a camp, you don't have a proper diet. You have the chills, and I didn't die from pleurisy during the camp year in the march, the death march, or didn't have pneumonia. But after the war, it's, you know, your body, you were not living under this, you know, you lived, how would I say, in the camp you sort of strived. The adrenaline was pumping all the time. Mm-hmm. And here the pressure was off, and somehow the body sort of gave up. It couldn't resist the big change.
Couldn't adapt to the big change.
To adapt to this big change, you see. She right away, she stripped me. I mean, I had a dirty Hitler Youth shirt, and I had a corduroy breeches that I had to cut down because my legs were this big. And I had a pair of boots, Hitler Youth boots. I had to cut them off, made it into slippers, and this is the way I came back to Kasha. When I got off the troop train, of this Russian troop train in Kasha, I sat down in this beautiful park, and I looked at myself. How can I go into this beautiful city looking like, I mean, you wouldn't believe what I look like. So I was full of lice. My head was full of lice. She took some chemicals and she gave me a bath, gave me some clothes, and she propped me up. I couldn't lay down. The next day she took me to the doctor, and he said, I've got to be taken to the hospital right away. She lined up, she got a farmer with a horse and buggy. They put me on this cart with a buggy with some straw behind me, and I was sitting for 50 kilometers all night until he arrived in the hospital. So this is what she did. She did for me what my mother would have done had I come back from some kind of a terrible place. In fact, Ili Klinka, she saved 3 pictures when our home was ransacked to the bare walls. Pictures were flying through the air, and she saved 3 pictures of my family, and she gave them to me when I returned. I still have them, and these were the 3 pictures were the only treasures that I brought with me to Canada. I came with less than $1 in change in my pocket, but I had these 3 pictures.